Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. As usual, we have a rolling start where people kind of sign in. Because of the security details, we have to sign them in as they join. But I want to thank our good friend, and how fortunate we are to have a scholar of such a caliber in our community, Dr. Malka Simkovich, who will be speaking today on topic of the 10 plagues in Jewish tradition. Dr. Simkovich is the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and the director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU. She is the author of The Making of Jewish Universalism, From Exile to Alexandria, and Discovering Second Temple Literature, the Scriptures and the Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, which has received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Dr. Simkovich's articles have been published in journals such as the Harvard Theological Review and the Journal for the Study of Judaism, as well as in online forums such as Lair House, thetorah.com, and the Times of Israel. She's involved in numerous local and international interreligious dialogue projects, which help to increase understanding and friendship between Christians and Jews. On a personal note, we are just so privileged to have her in the community, in the shul, as a friend. When colleagues around the country ask me for references of someone great to bring in, she is always the top of my list, always a hit, always interesting. I'm always learning something that I never knew. And so without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Malka Simkovich.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Gelman, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you all for making the time to be here on what I call Erev Pesach. I know it's a very busy day, a chaotic day, and I appreciate your making the time. The 10 plagues are probably the most foundational turning point in the origin story of the people of Israel, by which I mean the text, the Tanakh, tells us that the theme of this story, the theme of the Exodus, is knowing God. We have the theme of knowing God, this phrase focusing on the root, Yud Dalet Ayin, knowing God, throughout the story of the 10 plagues. And it's clear that the function of these plagues is both for Egyptians and Israelites, and indeed the entire world, to recognize the omnipotence, the omniscience of the one true God, the God of the Abrahamic family, the God of the Israelites. But there's also a major question when it comes to appreciating these 10 plagues, which our children, if they go to yeshiva day schools, they come home with projects celebrating each and every plague, glorifying this as a series of divine expressions of love for the Israelites. They probably say Jews, but Israelites. But the question really is an ethical question. How can we celebrate this? How can we celebrate these plagues as a marker of divine love for the Jewish people, and at the same time recognize the suffering that these plagues created, even though it's clear that those who were suffering were the oppressors of the Israelites? How could we celebrate this series of punishments, essentially, even if they are justified? And so what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is trace how these plagues were understood, first in the Second Temple period, and then the early rabbinic period, and then we'll do some medieval sources. And I'm going to set these texts against a few Christian texts. And what we're going to see is that as we move into the later rabbinic period, the presentation of the plagues becomes more and more extreme. And not only that, but the presentation of Paro becomes more and more vilified, not as an enemy of the people, but as an enemy of God. And if you can trace this development of increasingly extreme and increasingly negative portrayal of the Egyptians and their culture and their leader, Paro, if you set it against Christian texts, you will see something very interesting, which is that the association between Jews and disease, Jews and plagues, Jews and leprosy, and ultimately Jews and the Black Death becomes so prevalent that I don't think the rabbis could have avoided knowing that all, maybe not all, but many, many, many Christians out there associated Jews with plague. And so the question is, what is the relationship between these Jewish texts who are grappling with an ethical question, an ethical challenge. How could God sort of create this origin story of the people of Israel on the basis of these terrible punishments? And so how do we put these sources into conversation with Christian texts that are associating Jews with the plague? How do these sets of texts relate to one another? And what I think we're going to see is that later rabbinic texts are responding, or at least acknowledging, that there are people out there who are associating Jews with being leprous, with being spreaders of disease, with being spreaders of plague. So we're going to start in the Second Temple period, and this is the period from around 515 BCE to 70 CE. It's an often ignored period. Usually we look at our Tanakh, where we skip from the end of the Tanakh to the beginning of the Mishnaic period, after the fall of the temple in 70 CE, the Tannaitic period. And we tend to collapse everything that happens in between the end of the Tanakh and the beginning of the Mishnah. We tend to ignore this period, but this is actually a very significant time, because this is the time that Jews begin to read their biblical scriptures, and not only read them regularly in the synagogue as canonical and authoritative, but they also begin to interpret them. And in the 2nd century BCE, we have fascinating Jewish interpretations of the Exodus. And what's most interesting, I think, about these sources that I'm going to show you in a couple minutes is that these sources from the late Second Temple period are written in Greek, and most of them are written under Ptolemaic Hellenistic rule, which means, you probably know that after Alexander the Great dies, there are 3 major kingdoms. Among these 3 kingdoms that are Hellenist is the Ptolemaic, the Greek Empire, which includes Egypt. And so there are Jews living in Alexandria, so living in Egypt, but they're Hellenist. They're speaking Greek, and they're reading the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. All of this means is that there are Jews interpreting their scriptures while living in Egypt. And how would these Jews have understand the plagues? They have incredible ambivalence towards this story, which demonizes their home. There are up to 1 million Jews in the Second Temple period living in Egypt, which is a mind-blowing number. Alexandria is the New York City of the ancient world. We tend not to think about Egypt as being a comfortable home to the Jewish people, because of course in Devarim we're told, do not go down to Egypt, but actually Egypt held the biggest concentration of Jews in the diaspora in the Second Temple period. How did these Jews understand the story of the plagues? Well, in fact, they're quite uncomfortable with it. And some of these sources skip a little bit. They try to finesse the story, or they try to make the story not about the enmity between Paro and Moshe, but between specifically only those who oppress the Israelites. So they're sort of ignoring Paro as a character. When we go into the rabbinic period, we're going to see a much uglier picture of Paro. So let me share some sources so you can see concretely what I'm talking about. Okay, and I'm going to start with this source. Oh, no, not that one. Hold on, those are my notes. Oh, you don't need to see that. Hold on one second. Let's try this one. Okay, here we go. Okay, so this is, see, you all thought I did this without notes. No, nothing is on the fly over here. Okay, so I want to introduce you to a Greek play. And this Greek play is not written by a Hellenized Jew, but written by a very, very pious Jew known as Ezekiel the Tragedian, which is a very kind of dramatic, Ezekiel the tragedy writer. Now you have, again, in Egypt, Jews who are identifying as Jews. They are not assimilated. They live in Egypt. They appreciate aspects of Hellenism, but they're reading their scriptures. They're keeping Shabbat. They're observing circumcision and the dietary laws. And they write plays. And these plays, you might think of them as fan fiction or maybe proto-midrashic, although that term is very problematic, and I don't love that term, proto-midrashic, right? Because these are Greek texts. And they're Greek texts which expound on biblical stories in ways that argue for the integrity of Judaism at a time, we're going to see, when Judaism is under attack for being other. And this is probably the earliest time period in history where Judaism is being sort of subject to, later we would call, anti-Semitic rhetoric. And we're going to look at some of those texts later. But whatever the case is, this Ezekiel the Tragedian character writes a play called Exegog, the Exodus, and this is preserved in Greek. The reason why it's preserved is because a Christian fellow named Eusebius cites almost the entire thing in his history of the church 4 or 5 centuries later. And I'm not going to go through this entire text, but it's very fascinating. You also might have noticed that my source sheet is 30 pages long, and I will not torture you by reading anything word for word today. I never do that. But what I do like to do is I like to make nice long source sheets, and then if you're interested, I'm always happy to email the full text to you. So we are not going to do this word for word, but I do want you to get a sense of the major themes in this text. And the major theme is that the point of the Exodus is that all of humankind, whether they're Israelites, whether they're Egyptians, all of humankind learn to fear God through the plagues. It's not about punishing Paro specifically or punishing his goons specifically. It's about all of humanity. And so what you see in this story, which is really quite fast, it's not a story, but more of it's a play, it's meant to be performed. You see the theme of fear that is applied both to Moshe and Paro. And so when Moshe casts his staff down before Paro and it turns into a snake, this is what Moshe says: a fearful serpent, you and awe shall see. See there, I cast it down. Be gracious, Lord. How dreadful, huge, be merciful to me. I tremble at the sight, my limbs do shake. Fear not, stretch forth your hand and seize its tail. It's quite beautiful. Actually, this translation is very good. Now look at what Exegog says about the plagues. Thus bring down the wanton pride of men, of all people. Yet Paro shall not be moved by what I say until his firstborn child lies as a corpse. Then moved with fear, he'll send the people forth. So here, Paro is not inherently evil. He's not inherently a nemesis of God. He's simply unknowing. He's unknowing of the one true God. And the process of coming to know this God fills him with fear because he's never known an omnipotent creator God. The Egyptians worship a pantheon of a variety of gods. And so knowing that there's one true God fills him with fear and awe. And so in this text, in Ezekiel's play, you see over and over the sign of fear, right? The fearsome angel shall pass by, but you by night shall eat the roasted flesh, the Korban Pesach. So over and over, it's the fear of God that fills the Egyptians, but also the Israelites with awe. This is the theme that you see in much of Hellenistic Jewish literature in the late Second Temple period. Eusebius cites another Jewish historian, probably from Alexandria, named Artapanus. And Artapanus also recalls the story, which was clearly a very famous story in the Second Temple period. And amazingly, Jews in Alexandria, who are both reading their Septuagint and also quite enamored with many aspects of Hellenistic culture in Egypt. So they're not going to demonize Egyptian culture. So look at how Artapanus retells the Exodus story cited by Eusebius. Again, the theme here is not the evil nature of Paro, that we're going to see in later rabbinic sources. The theme here is not that Paro is evil or that Paro is the nemesis of God, but simply that the Egyptians and the Israelites are filled with fear. The fear of God is the objective of the story, but Israelites and Egyptians are meant to fear God alike. So we have, again, this theme that Moshe throws down the rod, which he had made a serpent, and all are terrified, right? Egyptians and maybe Moses and Aaron as well. Proceeding a little, he struck the Nile with the rod, right? And so Artapanus goes through each of the 10 plagues. The king does become presumptuous at this event, and he abuses the Jews with every kind of vengeance and punishment. But the demonization of Paro is not the focus of this story. The focus of the story is that Moshe and his brother Aaron, Moses and Aaron, instill the fear of God into Paro to the point where Paro is compelled to let the Jews go. Even in Judean texts that were composed in the late Second Temple period, texts like the one known as Pseudo-Philo, which is a rewriting also of much of the Bible, and Jubilees, even texts from Judea, seem to show some discomfort with the 10 plagues. And so in these texts, again, I'm not going to go through these line by line, but in these texts, again, we don't have demonization of Paro. In fact, in this document known as Pseudo-Philo, the plagues are almost, pardon the pun, skipped over like the firstborn. So, so anyway, So what does Pseudo-Philo do with the 10 plagues? I mean, it almost does not exist in his retelling of the story. When the king of the Egyptians died, another king rose up. Okay, that's all paraphrase from the beginning of Exodus, from Shemot. And he sent Moshe and freed them from the land of the Egyptians. God also sent 10 plagues and struck them down. These were the plagues. And then he just races through it. Blood and frogs and all manner of beasts and hail and death of cattle and locusts and gnats and darkness and the death of the firstborn. Sure, that too. And then he goes, and then he slows down the pace, right? Because that's not the focus for the author of this document. While they were going forth from there and sitting out, suddenly everything slows down. There seems to be a real discomfort with the plagues. Otherwise, the author of Pseudo-Philo could have expounded on and on and on and on of the 10 plagues, but he limits it to just one little verse, which to me suggests that he doesn't want to focus on this, right? But then look at how he expands on the scene of the splitting of the Reed Sea. The sons of Israel cried out to their Lord and said to Moses, the time of our destruction has come, right? This is a scene to dwell on. This is a scene to focus on. The 10 plagues, the author does not want to focus on that. There's another way to solve the problem of the 10 plagues that we see in late Second Temple sources, and that is to say, yes, it happened, the Egyptians suffered, it was terrible, but it wasn't exactly God. It was an angel that is deployed by God when God wants to enact punishment and death. And that angel, the 2nd century document Jubilees tells us, is known as Mastema. I don't want to go on and on about Jubilees and how this text came into being, but this is a work that was enormously popular, written originally in Hebrew, a rewriting of Bereshit, of Genesis, and the beginning of Exodus. Probably, despite its popularity, it was written by someone sectarian. The author of Jubilees adheres to a solar calendar, which in the ancient world and today, if you adhere to a solar calendar, it means that you think that everyone who doesn't keep your calendar is eating on Yom Kippur, right? So if you adhere to a solar calendar, you are not part of what we would consider to be mainstream Jewish community. But regardless, Jubilees was probably a very, very popular book in the Second Temple period. It preserves a lot of traditions that resurface in later Midrashic collections, fascinating stories that would be familiar to you, even if you haven't read the book of Jubilees. And the last 2 chapters of Jubilees focus on the Exodus story, but the individual enacting punishment is not God directly. It is this evil angel Mastema. And so I want to move through these sources rather quickly because these 4 documents, 2 from probably Alexandria, 2 from Judea, not all written in the same language, right? 2 written in Greek, 2 written in Hebrew, are grappling with the same problem. And the problem is, how can we rest our origin story on a series of events which caused incredible pain to others, and then argue for the integrity of our religion and argue for the beneficence of our God at the same time, as we'll see, that others are accusing Jews of misanthropy, of insularity, of not being team players? How can we argue that we are in fact team players when we have scriptures that celebrate the extreme punishment of Egyptians? And this is especially a current crisis for those Jews who are happily living in Egypt among Egyptians under the Ptolemaic Empire. And so this is a huge question, and it's not a question that's totally resolved. Again, some Jews skip over the story. Others say, well, it wasn't exactly God, it was an evil angel deployed by God, right? Others say, well, yes, this all happened, but it's not that Paro himself was intrinsically evil, but only that all of humanity needed to learn how to fear God. So there are these different strategies. But what you see by the 1st century is a total shift in the presentation of the story. Because by the time we get to the late 1st century historian Josephus, something has changed of this story. And Josephus, also the early 1st century CE Alexandrian philosopher Philo, but we'll start with Josephus even though he's later. Josephus goes on and on and on and on about this story. In his 20-volume work, Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, and we'll see Philo in his own writings, really lean into the story. They do not skip over it, they do not ignore it, or just briefly try to justify it. But instead, Josephus leans into the inherently evil nature of Paro. Now, why does this happen? So again, I'm happy to send out the source sheet so you could see, but the presentation of Paro and Josephus is very, very, very negative, unlike the first four sources that we saw. The king is not simply enslaving the Israelites because he needs them economically, but he despises Moses. He despises the God of Moses. He despises the Israelites. There is a contrast between his impotence, essentially, and the omnipotence of God. Why does Josephus lean into the story and go out of his way to so extensively argue for the evil nature of Paro? Before I answer that question, I want to show you similarly a treatise written by the early 1st century CE philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Again, you have a figure living in Alexandria who is not Hellenized. This is an observant Jew. Philo observes the big three identifying markers of Jewish practice in the ancient world: Shabbat, circumcision, dietary law. He defends the integrity of the Jewish religion. He does not believe in allegorizing these laws to the point that they should not be observed. So we would call him an observant Jew, whatever that would have meant in Egypt in the early 1st century. And at the same time, he doesn't speak Hebrew. He doesn't speak Aramaic. He's a Greek-speaking Jew. He's reading the Septuagint. In other words, he's reading the scriptures in Greek translation. And he knows the Septuagint code. Now, if you think that Josephus wrote a lot about the 10 plague story, take a look at how Philo writes about this story in his treatise called On the Life of Moses. Oh my gosh, there's so much in Philo that I don't even know what to focus on, but I'm going to slowly scroll down so you get a sense of how Philo vilifies, demonizes the Egyptians as a people and their leader Paro. Again, this would have been very risky. Philo is living in Alexandria in the early 1st century CE. That would be like me writing a long treatise about the evils of Chicago politics. Well, actually, that is not so hard to do. So maybe that's not a great comparison. But maybe that would not stir up any controversy at all. But in any case, look at what Philo says over here. If God was desirous to admonish the Egyptians rather than to destroy them. For if God had truly designed to destroy the Egyptians once and for all, he would not have employed animals to be, as it were, I think that's a typo, co-adjudicators, I think, in the work of destruction, but rather such heaven-sent afflictions as famine and pestilence. And in the second place, okay, so the first point is, if God was really so evil, right? If God was unjust, he would have just destroyed all the Egyptians in a second. But God is not just, God is merciful. And therefore, God brought punishments, not punishments that would destroy the Egyptians, but punishments that would compel them to repent. And let the person who might criticize this God learn a lesson which is necessary to be learned and applicable to every condition and age of life. And what is this lesson? That men, when they make war, seek out the mighty powers to gain them over to their alliance. This is very, very hard Greek. Such as shall make amends for their own want of power. But God, who is the supreme and mightiest of all powers, having no need of assistance, if he ever desires to use any instruments, as it were, does not choose the most mighty or the greatest things, since he takes but little heed of their capacity, but uses insignificant and small agents. Okay, the point here again is that people who make war use the most extreme instruments available to them to annihilate their enemy. But God doesn't need to do that. God is so omnipotent that all he has to do is use little instruments, not to annihilate, but to teach a lesson. So for Philo, these are chastisements. Such then were the chastisements which were inflicted by the agency of the brother of Moses, that is Aaron. And so in other words, the story of the Exodus, Philo argues, is not a story which calls into question the ethical concern of the Jewish God, but it's a story which affirms the reality that God is the beneficent, merciful, and one true God. In other words, Philo says, if you're going to argue that the Jews worship a God that is not interested in all of humankind, well, you're wrong. And in fact, it's the very opposite. God is interested in the piety of all of humankind. And so he gently chastises to get all people to repent. And this is a major theme in the writings of Philo, that the universal God, right, the God of the Jewish people is not simply and only a covenantal God who only cares about the Jews, but a God who cares about the piety and the behavior and the welfare of all people. And so the impetus for the 10 plagues is God's gracious and merciful desire for all people to get on the right path. And this is very, very important to Philo, this idea. On and on and on. I mean, Philo's very loquacious. Okay, I don't even know. I think he's only like plague number 4 over here. Oh no, now he's in the 10th plague. Hold on one second. Whew, Philo likes to write. Such then were the afflictions and punishments by which Egypt was corrected, not one which ever touched the Jews, although they were dwelling in the same cities. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. This is the same extraordinary and almost incredible thing by the very same events happening in the same place at the same time, that one people were destroyed and other people were preserved. Okay, great. I mean, this, okay, I really have to stop here. Okay, so now what happens? Why is it that Josephus and Philo lean into the notion that Paro is evil and that the Egyptians are also inherently set against the people of Israel in terms of their piety, and also B, that God is not only ethical, but also even more than that, God is merciful on the sinners? What is motivating Philo and Josephus to spend so much time and energy on this idea? What motivates them, and we're going to see the same theme in later rabbinic literature briefly, is that in the late 2nd century BCE, rumors start to circulate about the Jewish people that these Jews are dirty, they're diseased, they're lepers, they spread sickness, and all the things that you might think actually derive from the medieval period. You might know that the Jews were blamed in many communities in Europe for the Black Plague, and they were burned alive because they were held responsible in some communities for the Black Plague. This notion that Jews spread plague goes back to the Greco-Roman period. It goes back to the Hellenistic time. And so when these writings begin to circulate, Josephus is very sensitive to them. And the stories he views, they're meant to undermine the integrity of the Jewish people, meant to undermine their origin story, because what these stories do is they turn the Exodus story on its head. Oh, you Jews are saying that your God brought plagues upon your enemies? Well, that's because you're doing a cover-up, you Jews. What you're trying to cover up is the reality that, in fact, you're the ones who are diseased. You're the ones who spread plague. And Josephus writes the first systematic defense of the Jewish religion to have ever been produced at the end of the 1st century CE. It's known as Against Apion. Many of the anti-Jewish writings that we have that were written in the late Second Temple period were, we know about them because Josephus cites them. And this is obviously very helpful for us to understand what's going on in the late Second Temple period. Josephus cites many Greek and Roman writers, and also older, even Egyptian writers, and writes what they say about Judaism, mostly very not complimentary, and rebuts them. And so, for example, he cites Lysimachus, a figure named Lysimachus, as saying the following about the Jews' origin story. Yes, we know what they say in their Bible, that miraculously their God brought plagues about the enemy, but Lysimachus says, here's the real story. The Jewish people were afflicted with leprosy, scurvy, and other maladies. They took refuge in the temple. They lived a mendicant existence, right? They were poor, and they just like scavenged whatever they could. The victims of disease being very numerous, a dearth ensued throughout Egypt. So the king consulted an oracle, and the oracle told him to purify all the temples of impious and impure persons, to drive them out, right? To drown those afflicted with leprosy and scurvy. In other words, to drive out the Jews. Right? And I think that I have another typo over here, and I'm very sorry about that. I don't know what that means. It might be son, S-O-N, but I'm not sure. I have to go back and double check because that's a typo. So anyway, on receiving these instructions, the king summons the priests, and he orders them to draw up a list of unclean persons and to deliver them into military charge to force them into the wilderness and pack the lepers into sheets of lead and sink them in the ocean. And so there are stories going around in the late Second Temple period that despite whatever the Jews convince themselves of or tell themselves of based on their scriptural legends, the reality is that the Jews were the ones who were plagued, and the Jews were driven out of Egypt, not miraculously taken out by the one true God, but pushed out because they were disease spreaders. This idea is also cited by a fellow named Apion, cited in Josephus's work Against Apion, because Apion is the worst of the worst for Josephus. And again, Apion says something very similar to Lysimachus. He says that our ancestors were neither Egyptians by race, right? Outsiders. Jews are always outsiders. They're of a different ethnos. Race is a complicated word here that I'm not going to go into. Nor were they expelled from that country in consequence of contagious disease or similar affliction. No, so this is Josephus arguing against that claim that they were spreading contagious diseases or similar afflictions, and then he goes on and on to rebut that idea. So, you know, there's no way, obviously Josephus knows about these notions because he cites them. And there's no way, to my mind, that he rewrote his version of the Exodus story without keeping these accusations in mind. I'll show you one more from Appian. So Appian says that there are 110,000 Jewish fugitives who were chased out of Egypt. And he gives an astonishing and implausible explanation of the etymology of the word Shabbat, right? The Jews they rest every 7 days. After a 6 days march, Appian says, they develop, this is not so pretty, tumors in the groin, and that is related to a Greek word, sabaton, and so they keep, isn't this like disgusting and offensive, right? The Jews keep this Shabbat because with this disease they had to rest every 7 days. Can you imagine? That's what people said about why the Jews kept their Shabbat, and Appian provides etymological connection to this other word related to disease. Okay, so now what we know is by the end of the Second Temple period, by the 1st century, we have Greeks and Romans who are associating the origin story of the Jewish people with disease, with contagion, with plague. We also have late Second Temple Jewish thinkers, Josephus and Philo, who are saying, no, we're arguing for the integrity of the Jewish people and for the God that the Jewish people worship, and whatever plagues were brought upon the Egyptians represents the behavior of a just and merciful God. So now this takes us into the rabbinic period. And again, you know, I have 16 pages left on my source sheet, so we are not going to be doing this word for word. But I want to show you a very, very fascinating reading that I'm sure is familiar to you because it's connected to why we take 10 drops of wine out of our cup on the Seder night. But it's a really fascinating exposition of a strange 2 verses in Shemot. And so I'm going to read those to you, and then we'll up our pace a little bit. Vayisa malach him haolech lifnei machane Yisrael vayelech me'achareim vayisa amud ha'ana mipneim ve'amud me'achareim. I said God's name because I said the whole verse. Okay. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them, took its place behind them. But now look at this very strange, what's going on in this pasuk, in this verse. Vayavo bein machane Mitzrayim ubein machane Yisrael. Okay, so the angel of God goes between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. The cloud was there with the darkness, it lit up the night. But one did not come near the other the whole night. So what is the one and what is the other? So is it the anan and the what is the lo karav ze el ze? What's not coming near the other all night? So you might know this phrase because it's in our liturgies, also in Yeshayahu Perek Vav, who comes alongside one another to praise God in the celestial spheres. Well, of course, it's the angels. So in Yeshayahu Vav, we have this grand, majestic scene that the prophet witnesses where the angels are coming together to praise God. Now, this is very similar language. In fact, when we think of Karav Zel Zev Amar, when we do Kedusha in Shul, we're probably not thinking about Shemot Yadal. We're probably thinking about Yeshayahu Vav. So the rabbis want to know, why is this particular phrase used? Like, what's going on here? Well, how do we translate this phrase? And so Rabbi Yochanan says, what's the meaning of lo karav zel ze kol halayla? What's the meaning? Well, they wanted to come together. The angels, so he connects it to Yeshayahu Vav, right? The angels wanted to come together and praise God, right? That's what we see in Yeshayahu Vav. They're coming together, karav zel ze. They're coming together and they're praising God. And so they're about to do it, right? It's this momentous watershed moment in the history of the Israelite people, right? They're finally being released from their slavery. And God says, no. This is not the time for you to come together. You can't be mikarev or whatever. You can't come together and praise me at this time because the work of my hands are drowning, right? So how could you possibly rejoice at this sad time? Now we have a number of other rabbinic statements that portray God not like Philo does, where God is punishing in order to chastise, in order to perfect, in order to galvanize repentance. But in fact, God is chastising because it's necessary, but tragic, right? So that's a little bit different from Philo, right? Philo was saying, no, this is ideal. It's great. God was proud, right? This is the merciful thing to do, Philo says, right? It was merciful to slightly punish, to get the Egyptians to repent. But the rabbis say it was necessary, but not necessarily merciful. And the fact that it was necessary, but tragic, makes God distressed, right? Even more distressed than the celestial beings who serve him. Now, you also see in later rabbinic texts, I'm not going to go through all of these because I want to leave time for questions or comments if there are any, but you see an increased demonization of Paro. Oh, I want to show you this piyut that I found because this is stunning and like unbelievable. This is a piyut from the early medieval period. I did not know about. There are actually two of them, and what's fascinating again is that you have this piyut written in Hebrew, maybe in the 9th or 10th century, that depicts Paro as the enemy in a way that, again, you don't see it in the Second Temple period. You don't even see it in the early rabbinic texts. But the presentation of Paro here as the enemy of God is a new idea. So Paro is not just some, many leaders enslaved various ethnic groups, various people in the ancient world. But here, Paro is not just someone who enslaves, but an existential enemy of God, an enemy of everything that the Jewish people stands for. So I really can't do this in English because it's just so beautiful. But I guess I will. If Paro should refuse to release my children, but I'll send this to anybody again who wants. If he fails to feed the name of the living one, if he should cast my babes into the river. Actually, if I said that this is written in Hebrew, it's a mistake. It's written in Aramaic. I will seek reckoning from him just as he sought from my children. If he acts the tyrant against the children, if he sits and enslaves them with mud and bricks, all his firstborn I will murder at midnight. And this was translated by a professor named Laura Lieber, who works on piyut. And I only found this translation in her book. So I really think that this translation is quite new. I don't know that it's been published in English until her book came out like 2 years ago. And then there's a second piyut where it refers to ha'oyev, ha'oyev, ha'oyev. So the enemy said, I will hitch my chariot with sword unsurpassed, go forth the heroes. Amar oyev, esor merkava, becharava delomit rabava. It's just very beautiful Aramaic. Okay, but the thing that's interesting to me here is how Paro is the enemy of Moshe and the enemy of God. So every stanza here begins Amar Oyev, except for the end we have Amar Moshe Ro'ei Yisrael Hazina Nohe Kitzon Yosef Yosheva Kruvim Hofia. Hazina, of course, is imitating the great song that Moshe sings at the end of Devarim. Moshe says, "O shepherd of Israel, give ear. You who lead the Yosef like a flock. You are enthroned on the Kruvim, shine forth." And so the enemy talks and talks and talks and talks. I'm going to do all these horrible things to Bnei Israel, but then the piyut ends with Moshe saying, Hashem, help us. And then presumably the end of the story, which is not in the piyut, is God intervenes because Moshe uttered this one brief phrase. So the enemy talks and talks and talks and talks and gets nowhere. But the enemy, of course, Paro, is demonized in a way that you don't see in earlier sources. And then in Shemot Rabbah, you have Paro laughing at them and screeching at Moshe and Aaron like a chicken. You have a caricature of Paro. He's no longer fearsome and omnipotent, but he's silly. He is not knowing. He is not just a worthy opponent of God, but he's a joke. He's a caricature, and he's an enemy of God, absolutely. Okay, so I want to, with the remaining time, so I have a lot of sources here about Paro and his behavior. I'm going to not go through all of this because I want to spend the last few minutes directing your attention to what's going on in medieval Europe while these sources, so Shemot Rabbah is a very, very late midrash. Shemot Rabbah is collected in the medieval period. And so if you're going to, it's unclear exactly what the date of Shemot Rabbah is, but this caricature of Paro, I would say late medieval. I would assume that the writers of these traditions are acutely sensitive to what is going on in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries when it comes to a particular theme that I'm sure you've heard of, and that is the trope against the Jews for poisoning the wells. Now, why are Jews poisoning the wells? Because if you poison the well, you can cause mass death, right? You can cause disease. This is similar but not identical to the blood libel, which, by the way, I believe strongly, also derives from the Greek period. Because the blood libel, Josephus talks about a blood libel. Josephus says that, I think it's also Appian, but I'm not sure, that according to Appian, all the Jews would kidnap a Greek once a year, keep him in the temple, fatten him up, and then slaughter him once a year. That to me is a blood libel. So these ideas that become very prevalent in medieval Christianity actually derive from the Hellenistic period, in my opinion. So the two big tropes against the Jews in the medieval period are the blood libel and the well poisoning. And so I think we have to think about how the portrayal of Paro becomes worse and worse and worse in light of these accusations against the Jews. So look at what William of Chartres says about the Jews. The matter of the Jews who are subjected to me by the yoke of servitude pertains to me, lest they oppress Christians by their usury. Now, of course, Jews were totally limited in what they could do professionally, and so Jews were money lenders. They were shut out of most other professions. I wish to do what pertains to me concerning the Jews, let them abandon usury, or let them leave my lands completely, lest it be further defiled by their filth. And I got this quote from a very, very outstanding book by David Nierenberg called Anti-Judaism that I highly recommend. He's also the dean of University of Chicago Divinity School, a very important thinker. Look at this woodcut. This was produced in 1493. It's in a document of the document is known as the Nuremberg Chronicle, but this is a very disturbing image, and it's an image of the burning of the Jews at Deggendorf in Germany in 1338. Now, after this massacre of the Jews, the massacre was justified based on the notion that Jews defiled the sacrament, the Holy Sacrament. But that's probably not historically why these Jews were burned. Now, the burning of Jews happened not once or twice, but actually dozens and dozens of times in the medieval period. And I'm sure Dr. David Shivas could tell you all about these various instances much better than me, but for my purposes, I want to note the association between Jews being diseased and the need that many Christians claimed, the need to annihilate the Jews. So look at what James Carroll, and I'll show you this book, a little show and tell. This is Constantine's Sword, another very, very highly recommended work. This is what James Carroll says about this period and the rumor of Jews poisoning wells to spread disease. Jews were ready to poison wells if they could, aiming not to just kill Christ, but Christians. Of course, this is not correct. This is the thinking. 27 Jews are executed for well poisoning in 1163. The charges are repeated in Breslov in 1226, Vienna 1267, in 1321. There's a conspiracy in France, on and on and on and on. But what's amazing to me, and this is the point that I want to make, is that the Black Plague occurs after all of this. So even before the Black Plague, right, when millions of Europeans are wiped out and the Jews in many, many, many communities are accused of spreading Black Plague, that's already a dominant theme. In other words, it's not because of the Black Plague, the people are like, well, we need someone to blame. Who should we blame? Let's blame the Jews. This is already happening. So it's very convenient, or not convenient, but it's quite organic. It's an organic response to say the Jews are spreading disease, as we have been saying for centuries. We've been arguing that Jews have been spreading disease for centuries. And so you can imagine that the arguing for the integrity of the Jewish God, justifying God's behavior when it comes to the Egyptians, these become very, very important themes in Jewish thinking about the story of Mitzrayim, of the Exodus. For many reasons, to argue for not just the justification of our God, but also for the incredible mercy that our God has towards all of humankind, and care and concern. All of this is fighting a wave of anti-Jewish portrayal of both Jews and the Jewish God as being threatening to society, of spreading disease, of spreading harm, and spreading death. Now I'm going to end with a few interesting portrayals of art. This is just fun. This is just fun stuff. There's a synagogue known as Dura Europos. It's a 3rd century synagogue in modern day Syria. And this might not look like much to you, but in Dura Europos, paintings were found on the walls, which interpreted biblical stories. And so some of these paintings are just unbelievable. That's inside Dura Europos. And you have vignettes of various biblical scenes, and included in these scenes is an image of the Exodus. Oh, that's just fun. That's not the Exodus. But do you see Aaron in Greek? See how that's written Aaron in Greek? Okay, but that's not, and this is also incredible. The women singing at the splitting of the sea. Okay, but this is what I want to show you. So it's hard to interpret what's going on here. This is the second picture is to the right of the first picture. And so here you have the Egyptian army on the left, and here you have the Israelites on the right going through, I think, the Red Sea. And then here you have the hands of God. Here's Moshe, Moshe with his staff and Aaron. And so what you don't have here is Paro, right? You don't have Paro. What I see in this picture is Paro is not part of the story. He's not the main nemesis. It's not an existential clash between a good and evil as embodied by Paro and God, but it's a story of the redemption of the Israelites. And then you have the Egyptian army, sure, but you have God here. You don't have Paro, as far as I can see. Now, if you look at medieval representations of the story in what's called the Golden Haggadah, which is 13th century Haggadah from Catalonia, you do see Egyptian royalty in this image, at least according to the interpretations which I've seen. So for example, here you have the Jews leaving Egypt. So when I move my cursor, do you see it when I'm moving it? You see, okay, great. Okay, thank you, Rabbi Gauman. Okay, so you see they're holding little balls of dough. So that's their matzah. And according to the interpretations that I've seen, that this individual here who looks very medieval would be Paro sending him off. And that these individuals over here in this right square, that would be the royal mother. And these are the Egyptians leading their firstborn dead off to be mummified and buried. And then you have the Egyptians drowning in the sea. First, they're chasing the Israelites, and then they're drowning in the sea. But you do have Paro and maybe the Queen Mother being a dominantly represented in this image. And so what I want to argue is that as we move, I'm not going to show you Mark Chagall's Exodus because that's a whole different kind of worm, so you could look it up. I do believe that we need to wrap up, but I think that as we move into the medieval period and accusations against Jews and the spread of the spread of disease and plague amplifies, I think that we see an increasingly negative portrayal of Paro and of Egypt in general. And so, whereas in the Second Temple period, Jews who are living in Egypt are actually ambivalent towards Egypt because this is their home. And even in earlier biblical sources, I would say that there's an ambivalence towards Egypt. Even as Moshe says, don't go down to Egypt, there's still an attraction to Egypt, right? Yirmiyahu writes a letter, you could look it up in Yirmiyahu, I think it's chapter 41, Mem Aleph. Yirmiyahu writes a letter to Jews who have settled in Egypt and says, you can't be here, right? You're going to worship idols, you're going to assimilate, you can't do it. But the fact that Moshe, Yirmiyahu, and other leaders are saying, stop going to Egypt, suggests that there is an attraction to Egypt, that the Jews are attracted, right? What did they say? And a few weeks ago in a parsha that we read in synagogue a few weeks ago, the Jews are begging to go back. They're glorifying Egypt as a place that is fertile, as a place that that was sort of their womb, right? That's where they came into their sort of national identity. And there's always an attraction to go back. And the Jews in the Second Temple period who live in Egypt feel very defensive about Egypt, and they don't want to demonize Egypt because they're also appreciating the cultural gifts that Egypt provides them with. And so you see an increased binary as we move into the medieval period that I think very much influences how we think about the story today as, you know, an existential clash between Paro and God. But I'm not sure that that is always how Jews interpreted the story. So I'll stop there in case anybody has questions or comments.
First of all, before any other questions come in, I just want to thank you. That was phenomenal. Incredible. I took some great notes here and looking forward to reading through all of these sources. If I can ask just a couple questions. I mean, maybe it's obvious at this point. I didn't realize how deep the association between anti-Semitism and the story of Tiberia Mitzrayim went. I'm wondering if you believe that that's why many of the blood libels are associated with baking matzah. In other words, that's the symbol of the holiday. So is there a theory that associates blood libels and matzah because of ancient anti-Semitism in Alexandria? That's one.
I mean, I think it's very possible, but I think we also have to take into account what Pesach meant to early Christians, that Jesus was a symbolic replacement of the Paschal Lamb. So, I'm not telling everybody to prepare for Pesach by reading the New Testament, God forbid, but, or, you could do whatever you want. But if you do read the Gospel of John, you will see that Jesus does function as a symbolic replacement of the Paschal Lamb. And so for Christians who view the temple as having been replaced, and they view really the Jews as having been replaced and the covenant as having been replaced, Pesach is especially significant. And then, of course, you have the whole question of Holy Week, what Christians call Holy Week, which is the week leading up to Easter, and the liturgy that until very recently was recited is quite upsettingly anti-Jewish. So on Good Friday, Christians until the Second Vatican Council would pray for the perfidy of the Jews. So Pesach has a lot of symbolism that I think really is developed by early Christians. But at the same time, some of these ideas, the notion that Jews are not team players, that they don't share table fellowship, that they don't assimilate properly like other peoples, that all derives from the Greek and Roman period. And the Exodus story was used to prove that. So I think that you're right? Like people are saying, look at these Jews' scriptures. Even their scriptures celebrate misanthropy. And that's a Greek word, misanthropia, being anti-people. Even their own scriptures show how Jews keep to themselves and aren't team players. But it does become something new in the early Christian period. It becomes something very symbolically significant when we're talking specifically about Pesach.
I guess one other question I had. I'm familiar with conflicting midrashic sources as far as whether Paro was placed at the foot of the Sea of Reeds at the time of the Yam Suf, and I'm wondering if there is, in your mind, an association between these two shitos, these two opinions. If Paro is present there, there's sort of divine retribution for the evil Paro for what he did, whereas if he's not part of that, he's either taken care of elsewhere or just not part of the story anymore. This is really just about the Jewish people going free, and we're not here to stomp on Paro. I'm wondering if you think that's a fair read of those different approaches.
I would be really interested to know whether the tradition that Paro is present and witnessing the splitting of the sea, whether that's a later midrash, because if it is a later midrash, then I think it does confirm what I'm saying, which is that Paro becomes an increasingly central part of the story as an enemy of God, who again serves as a negative contrast, God being the most beneficent and ethical, and Paro being the symbolic enemy of everything that God and the Jews stand for. And again, in earlier sources, Paro was not as major as a major player in the story. So I'd be very curious to know what the sources are, but I don't know offhand.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for a couple other questions if anyone has. I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself or.
Well, I'm happy to tell you my email address. Also, it's msimkovich@ctu.edu if you have any questions, if you want the source sheet.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Simkovich. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to having you back in person. We see you in person all the time, and wish everybody a Chag Kasher Sameach. Next Sunday's lecture, which was supposed to be initially Rabbi Moshe Tarragon from Yeshivat Har Etzion, he has graciously agreed to postpone his talk till after Pesach so that I can give my Shabbos Hagadol drasha next Sunday at this time. The topic will be Pesach and the cancel culture, just to get people excited. If you think about it, there are a number of themes in the Pesach story about people who have been canceled, or things that we cancel out because they're either inconvenient, uncomfortable for us, and it might tie into some of the things that Dr. Simkovich was speaking about today. So I welcome you to join me next week. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day and a Shavua Tov.
Thank you.